Thanks.
Okay.
Here's your clicker.
Well, thank you for having me. My talk is about dysfunction. The dysfunction that occurs between people with very different personalities, different perspectives and attitudes towards life, and how to resolve that through better communication and organizational design. I want to begin with a benchmark. We're talking about two types of people, nerds and experts. Who in this room is an expert? Who's a nerd? Okay, let me ask in a different question. How many of you have degrees in computer science, statistics, econometrics? Okay, and how many of you have a degree in political science, stuff like that? How many of you like the idea of engaging with people on a weekend? Oh, come on. How many of you really don't like the idea of engaging with other people on a weekend? Okay, great. So I have two nerds, and everybody else is experts. Great. How many of you have analytics or data people in your companies? Okay, all of you, great. And I want you to be very honest in this next piece. I want you to rank 1, 2, or 3 the kind of efficacy of your analytics or data teams. 1 is completely useless. 3 is if they died tomorrow, I would also throw myself off a building, which is completely existentially essential. And number 2 is meh, something in the middle. Who is 1? Who's 2? Okay, who's 3? You throw yourself off a building. Okay. So basically, and who's 2? Raise your hands again. Okay, that's about 40% of you. So that's roughly the kind of state of the industry. Today, I want to talk essentially about that kind of primary challenge, is that roughly according to you, about 60% of you are saying that your analytics, your data science teams are either 1s or 2s. Number 1 is if they died tomorrow, you wouldn't really give a shit. And the second category of people thinks if they died tomorrow, then you could kind of like mumble along. My experience is kind of 2 parts. Number 1 is my history in politics, and number 2 is my history in commercial organizations. And essentially navigating a path from being kind of a useless, emaciated analyst like this into becoming something that was more important for an organization. And I'm going to split my story into 2 stories. 1 is in politics. So beginning in 2009, I worked in the analytics team in 2008, but we largely won the election because we had a new president. Our opponent elected kind of a whack job to be his VP. Our polling went up immediately due to a financial crisis, and people celebrated me even though I provided probably 0 marginal value to what was going on. But underneath, there was something deeply rotting within our party. And what was rotting was an over-reliance on narrative, habit, and false expertise as a means of understanding truth. Very frequently, I would walk into meetings, and I don't know if you guys have been in this meeting, but somebody would present a way that we're going to launch into a campaign, spend $10 million, turn people out to vote, measure their opinion. And the basis for that was really based on rank, which is essentially the number of years that somebody had been in an organization, volume, which is how loud or how big of an asshole that person was, salary, which is how much that person was paid, and habit. In order to achieve scale, habit is a very good and persistent thing because it allows you to have a repeatable scale. But what's the challenge with that? You got to keep learning, right. It takes you to bad solutions. So beginning in 2009, we began to question what we were doing. And we essentially created this board of all the things that we assumed were true, but we didn't know that were true. And the first one that we thought about was, what does it take to turn somebody out to vote? For many years, the Democratic Party had been anchored in a certain set of communication of how you turn people out to vote. And beginning in 2009, we began to question that. So I want to take another poll. We decided to test this through a number of channels. We tested it by mail, we tested it digitally, we tested it through person-to-person communication. We tried 3 different modes of communication or methods of communication. One was boring, which is kind of a letter from a prominent senator addressed to people with kind of the straightforward information about their polling place. Number 2 was more of a graphical postcard that provided people with the same type of information, both kind of more entertaining information. And then 3 was a persuasion postcard where we provided the reasons that you should vote for a Democrat and the reasons that you shouldn't vote for a Republican. I'm going to take a poll. Who thinks 1? Who thinks 2? Who thinks 3? Okay, why do you think 3? It connects to emotion, right. Why else? It's more of a story. Yeah, so it's totally wrong. Totally wrong. And so the Democratic Party had been built on that because the assumption was that connecting to story was more important than connecting to identity, right? The letter connects to identity because it references what you've done in the past, and it connects you to a set of principal validation, which Americans care very deeply about. And number 3 is it feels official, right? The officialness connects more to identity than it does to a story. People don't give a shit about stories. What they care about is their own egos. And what we realized was that in order to get people to turn out, we had to connect to their ego and not to their id. And that was an immense discovery because, well, I'll ask a question, why was this important? I just kind of laid it out. But at the same time, how do you think this is probably distracting in our organization? So imagine, go back to this like emaciated kid here. So I come up and I get in front of the principals of the Democratic Party and I say like, hey, guess what? You've been doing our messaging for the last 25 years. It turns out it's been built on a foundation of lies. How do you think that went over? Not so good, right? So the question then became, is that we had established over the course of a number of tests that the Democratic Party, in terms of its outreach and tactics, was built on a foundation of lies. That was bad, right? The next step is what you do about that. And so what you do about that is typically in most organizations, after this happens, people talk about technology, right? How many people have long conversations about marketing technology after something about truth, right? So what we realized very soon is that me and this guy got in a room, David Civis. Do you people know who David Civis is? Probably not. He was the political director at the White House. He's kind of a fancy pants, has a nice tie, nice suit, et cetera. But in order to make this work, before we talked about Hadoop, before we talked about record conciliation, before we talked about the set of randomized controlled experiments in order to assess the value of our tactics or how we're going to kind of budget $1 billion, we had to figure out a personality difference between 2 people, me, the nerd, and the expert, David Civis. David Civis and I are very different people. Why do you think this relationship is challenging? Does anybody else have a problem like this, where you have like a person like this that works in your organization? Be honest. Why is this challenging? Okay, well, whatever. There's a few reasons that this is challenging. Number 1 is that we have different interpretations of truth, right? People like me, or people like this guy over here, see the world in black and white. You have things that are either true, they are false, and there is nothing in between. People like David Civis, who are equivalently intelligent, see the world through a set of collated narratives. And their job is to essentially understand human existence through the different narratives, where people like me essentially see a matrix of dots, right? And we want to build observable truth over those dots. And as a result, we miss things while David Civis is attempting to capture his experience in a set of personal narratives. Those things, however, can come into deep conflict when you're trying to understand something like this, which is one person who thinks that truth is defined by a compelling narrative, and one person who thinks that truth is defined by a set of bar charts, right? And so David Civis and I sat down over beer, which is a good way of resolving differences between people who have different personalities, and we essentially settled that we were going to create a grand bargain between the nerds and the experts. And that grand bargain was going to consist of 3 things. Number 1, things I was going to give to him. Number 2 is things that he was going to give to me. And then number 3 is from that conversation what we were going to agree about. The immense thing about why this is important is that we didn't begin with a conversation about technology. We didn't begin with a conversation about what KPIs that we were going to settle on. We began with a conversation about values. As I have kind of progressed into corporate America, the majority of conversations about analytics begin with a conversation about Hadoop or a segmentation strategy or what type of KPIs you're going to optimize against, as opposed to a conversation about values. Because the primary challenge that most organizations have in reconciling the difference between experts and nerds is a conflict of values. And because they ignore that conversation, they are never actually able to settle on terms of truth, terms of power, terms of influence, and what ultimately you're going to do when issues of deep conflict arise between narrative and between moments of fact. And so David and I decided we were going to write a list. I wrote my list, he wrote his list, and then we settled on a few things. So I'll begin with what I asked for, and I'll begin with what David asked for, go to what David asked for, and then what we settled on. So my list began with this, very simple. I asked to kill the sacred cows. So I essentially wrote out my kill list for David. And he's like, this is really weird that you're doing this, but okay. I said, we have established for 20 years that the way that we talk to voters is based on compelling narratives. I think that's a lie. I think that the way that we need to connect to voters is by connecting to their sense of entitlement and identity. That sounds horrible. I don't care. I want to see whether or not this is true or false, and then we're going to build our perspectives based on that. He said, fine. Number two is that I wanted our data science team to be intimately connected about tactical decisions. I was going to forego on strategy. I think strategy is a concept that is very difficult to abstract into a quantitative narrative. And so I decided that we were going to be in the room for things that involve tactical decisions and operational decisions. Tactical decisions being about when we were spending money, right? Because things that can be about spending money is things that you can measure. Things that aren't about spending money are things that are more difficult to measure. So we reconciled that I would be in the room about all topics that had to do with the budget. Number three is that we were going to budget for knowledge up front. This is the most important decisions that we made. We agreed that we were going to raise around $1 billion in capital. And we decided, more or less arbitrarily, what percentage of that $1 billion would be dedicated to making sure that those $1 billion are spent effectively. Arbitrarily, we agreed that 2.5% of our budget would be dedicated to making sure that the $970 whatever million was going to be spent effectively. So essentially, $25 million was going to be spent, more or less arbitrarily, to make sure that $1 billion, essentially 2.5% of the budget, was going to be dedicated to intelligence. And this one single decision, which is essentially an arbitrary heuristic, did more towards advancing a definition of truth because it dedicated him to understanding what was our level of commitment with money behind it. Even experts, all experts, whether or not you're a marketing person, you all understand money, right? And this was essentially the metric of ROI. He said, okay, great, if it's 2.5%, you have to show me a 3% improvement in ROI as a benchmark, otherwise you're losing, we're firing you. And I said, okay, great. I think I can do better than 3% improvement based on what we've seen in the past. And he asked me for a bunch of things. So most of you are experts. What have you asked your nerds for? What have you asked them for? Nothing? What have you asked them for? What is a hard conversation that you've had, and what have you asked them for? Yes? Show scenarios, okay. So simulations. Yep, great, that's a great example. What else? So you want forecasts of the future. I want you to show essentially what is like the different models of the future, and then the likelihood behind those models. That's a great thing to ask for. What else? What have you asked them for in terms of values? Okay. Do you ever feel like people lie to you at work? Do any of you use agencies? Do you ever feel like your agency has lied to you? Answer honestly. Yes or no? Okay, great. Do you ever feel like your analyst or your data team has ever lied to you? Great, okay. So the first thing that we agreed to, but that was the biggest concern about he become among the experts, was how do I ensure that people don't lie to me, right? The biggest challenge that retailers, companies, marketers have is that you people are often systematically lied to by people that have more information than you do, right? True or false? True or false? Awkward? Yes? True or false? So the resolution that David Civis told me to, very simply, is that you're going to share all the data and you're not going to cry about it. I'm going to give you this money, which is $25 million, but in exchange, you're going to share the data with everybody in the organization with root level access. I don't want dashboards. I don't want reports. I don't want your interpretation. I want that. But at the same time, when somebody wants root level access to the data at the person level or at the voter level, the donation level, et cetera, along with those forecasts, I want there to be instrumental accountability at the root level access such that if you're lying to me, then people will know. And then people will tell you that you're lying to me, and we'll take care of that, right? Number two, and this is the most important thing that David Civis asked me for, and I think is the most important thing that an expert can ask their analyst for, is to be as honest about negative outcomes as positive outcomes. So I'm going to ask you another question. How many of your agencies have come to you and told you about a desperate failure that they made in spending your money? I'm serious. How many have come to you and said, I spent this money and it did nothing or it did negative? Okay, what percentage of your marketing dollars do nothing or are negative? A lot, right? So based on that, some certain percentage of your conversations with your agency should be that whatever percentage of your dollars you think are wasted or do nothing or do negative, that's the equivalent percentage of your conversations that should be about your money doing nothing or doing something negative. So most of you are saying that the percentage, so let's say 40% of your marketing dollars are wasted on a consistent basis, which is scientifically natural. 40% of your conversation should be about your marketing dollars being wasted or being negative, but most of you are saying that 0% of your conversation. So you have a deficit of 40% in terms of what you're talking about, so 40% of your conversations with your advertising agencies are lies, right? So what David Civis told to me is he said, promise me when bad things happen that you will not lie to me, that you will tell the truth, and you will be as enthusiastic about your failures, about the 40% of time when we blow money. So the first time this happened, we ran a huge test. It was $1 million with a new messaging program, and I had to sit down with the experts, and I basically said, guess what? We spent $1 million, and we convinced a lot of Democrats not to vote for us anymore. And he said, I kind of want to fucking stab you, but I appreciate you for being honest, and let's do better next time. And as a result, we threw out the program. We saved roughly $100 million in capital that would have been spent on a useless, distractionary, garbage marketing campaign, and we put it on that because we built it with robust testing. So, what is the summary of the grand bargain? So first, we agreed on our values. The biggest thing is that David Civis and I had to reconcile the differences in our perspective and our personality before talking about Hadoop, MapReduce, Redshift versus Vertica, segmentation, blah, 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 blah. Next, we agreed on process, when and how the experts contribute, when and how with the nerds. So essentially, process is power. So number one is values, which is what is our agreement on truth, what is our agreement on lies. Number two is process, which is who's going to be in charge over spending capital and over accountability around power, right? And having that conversation very directly with those words, not with bullshit marketing language, but saying who has power and who doesn't have power over what. We agreed that I would have power over budget. I would not have power over narrative, and we agreed on that. Next, we agreed on technology and implementation. We said, okay, great. This is our agreement on truth and fiction. This is our agreement on process. And number three, this is how we think the technology is going to be most effective at implementing those set of values and implementing that process. If you agree that data should be shared, as a principle, that by its nature dictates the type of technology that you're going to use, right? You are not going to use Oracle, for example. Why? Because they'll get you into a horrible vendor lock-in situation where you have to pay them a bunch of money, blah, 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 and you'll be locked into something. You will have to choose implicitly some technology that will give you exportable root-level access to the data in a way that will provide, obviously with proper encryption, access to that in terms of the principles of accountability that you have established. Most companies do this backward, right? They have a conversation with their nerds and their experts, and they begin with this kind of weird abstract conversation about what are we trying to accomplish, and what's the technology that's going to do it, and then what's the process, and then how do we scale that? They do begin with the things that really we care about is what is true and what is false. You are going to tell me when 40% of my money is being blown on dog shit and when it's not being blown on dog shit. And if you don't have the terms of that established, then you are going to make the wrong decisions in terms of power and the wrong decisions in terms of technology. The output of this was very important. Number one, or in terms of the primary outcome was we established the process and the technology, but the output is that we built an organization built on truth, which is what he desperately cared about, dictated by both the science of what we were saying and the narratives that he was trying to build, and precision over feelings and personality. That the decision about values, process and power, and technology essentially rolled itself down into a set of measurements, tactile decisions, and strategic decisions that helped us make sure that we could most optimally spend the $1 billion in capital that we had to persuade the people to vote for us and then turn the people out to vote for us as effectively as possible. I'm going to say I did not work for the most recent campaign. I feel horrible about it. I wake up with night terrors about it. I'm sorry, America. After the campaign, I went and I asked a bunch of people, what is the biggest challenge that you face, right? And often people say, it's this software, that software, this, blah, 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 blah. But when I dig down to it and I get like a CEO good and drunk, not to make it awkward, this is what I hear the most. I have 100 data scientists and I have no idea what the hell they do all day. You guys are actually a little bit better than that. Only 60% of you believe in this. 40% of you actually think they're really important. 10% of you actually said this. 50% of you said kind of meh. And 40% of you think they're essential. And the biggest reason from what I can understand is, number one, is there hasn't been proper arbitration over the discussion over values. Number two is there hasn't been a process that regulates the distribution of power and decision making. And number three is that the technology decisions aren't based on that. And so I want to provide you the key recommendations that I've learned from my history in politics and how we've applied it to the world of commercial marketing. So number one is begin with a really awkward conversation to set your values, especially concerning structure, power, and truth, right? Structure very literally means who's in the room and sees the data, right? You can send as many PowerPoints and Confluence pages and whatever you want, but the most important decision you can make at the top is who should be in the room and who sees the data, who has root level access to the data. That is the most important thing. Number two is who or what algorithm makes the call, right? Increasingly, algorithms are making tactical calls over humans, right? And humans have more time to focus on strategic calls, which is a wonderful opportunity, but the step is to inventory what those tactical calls are and then decide agency over those tactical calls. Is it the nerd or is it the expert? The resolution, the bargain that we came to is that the nerds were going to take over decisions about capital and that the campaign or the experts were going to continue decisions about narrative because we didn't believe that that was something that could be properly abstracted. We could provide validation or disvalidation over their hypotheses, but we didn't believe that we could provide an abstracted scientific process to regulate our strategic decisions. We could provide data as an input into doing it, but we couldn't provide resolution. And number three is who measures the call and reads out the truth, right? So that meeting that I had when I was an awkward, emaciated 25-year-old, what was difficult about that meeting wasn't the outcome, it was the fact that we hadn't agreed on this. The organization hadn't agreed that this weird, bespectacled 25-year-old could come in and tell the Democratic Party that it was built on a foundation of lies. And as a result, it wasn't received as a cultural input into what we were doing, and it wasn't internalized as a fact. It was internalized as a conflict. And so the recommendation is to begin with this conversation. Number two is to build a process built on those values incrementally that works you iteratively towards a feedback loop. All of you have probably seen some type of chart like this, which says essentially kind of measurement, targeting, action, attribution, right? Everybody is going for something in those kind of like 4 key steps with some kind of central database, measure the activity in market, place your resources based on some type of like experiment or kind of prospective analysis. 3 is measure the activity of what that does or does not occur through proper attribution, and then kind of like repeat that cycle over and over and over again. This is extremely difficult to scale, right? It's extremely difficult because Story sells a product that helps you do it. Lots of people help you do it. But in terms of how you actually get this done, what David and I agreed to is essentially use case-based prioritization. So how do you scale this effectively in sequence? So if you get like a deck from like a management consultant, they'll give you like these work streams, right? And like, has anybody seen these like a PowerPoint deck that says, here are the 10 things you need to do? And do you become really confused by it? Why is that really confusing? Because they don't work together, right? Yes. And in a world of technology, things don't work together because they have to be properly instrumented at the column level and the row level, right? The column level means the columns have to achieve the same thing for the same people, and the rows mean that the rows have to provide observations about the people that you're talking about. That is very important, right? If your process cannot be instrumented at the column level and the row level, you don't have a process, you have a PowerPoint, and you are trapped in hell, right? So what do, right? So this is kind of our simple approach to it that we came up with in the campaign and thought about in the case of commercial, is you take all of your potential projects and you map them out in terms of estimated impact and how easy it is. Estimated impact is how much value is this going to provide to the organization. Is it going to be your churn management project, your promotion minimization project? Is it going to be your holiday plan? Is it whatever? And you essentially index that. And if you have to do this subjectively, that's fine, right? If you do more quantitatively in terms of financial outcome, that's fine. Do whatever you want. And then number two is you index it by how easy it is, right? And then you plot those all together, and you index everything by project value, where you take estimated cost divided by time and resources. Estimated impact divided by time and resources. Where this is what you start with, and then this is what you ignore, right? And over time, what that allows you to do is to build a process that is intermediate, or a process that is instrumented by row values and column values within your database. It is a use case-based prioritization as opposed to a subjective-based prioritization run on a PowerPoint. The path out of PowerPoint hell is to begin with use cases that are prioritized by value and cost, and then build the proper instrumentation of how to do that and ignore everything else. Begin with one, then once you have a process, essentially you've instrumented a feedback loop for one, you go to two. Once you build a feedback for two, you go to three. Once you've built it for three, you go to four. The opportunity cost around this is tremendous because you have to ignore important things or at least maintain habit, but this gets you on a path to success. Number three is, this is, I think, the biggest problem that we see in these conversations between experts and analytics, is that data scientists retreat, often, frankly, through cowardice, to something that they understand, right? And you see this often between experts and analysts, is that because people are scared of looking stupid in public conversations, they retreat to the domain of their brain that they understand, right? Experts retreat to, you don't understand people. Analysts retreat to conversations about Hadoop, MapReduce, blah, 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 blah. Those things are all important, but they are examples of cowardice, right? And so at the end of this, and so the challenge that people have is beginning with those most important things, which is values, which is what are the things that we actually care about, who has agency over those values, what is the process to do it, and then number three is the technology that we agree to do it. That should come last as opposed to first, because again, information sharing is one of the most important principles that an organization can share in a data-driven world. You agree that some people have power or some people don't have power. In a modern data-driven organization, data is power, right? You either understand truth and you have visibility into it, or you don't have visibility into it. And if you do, you're a manager, and if you don't, you're a peon, right? We can all agree on that. And so you just have to agree on that. In terms of the structure of your technology, you want the structure of technology to support the organizational design that we want. In our point of view, technology has gone through these kind of three big evolutions. 2008, 2012, 2016 more or less maps to our election experience, but we think this is roughly kind of similar to what has kind of gone on in the world. You have beginning like laptops, people just build their own thing. They do. Does anybody live in Excel world still? I know, right? So there's some things that's good about Excel world. One is like it's actually fast. You have a lot of customization that's local to the problem. But then the downside is you essentially have anarchy. Number two is this is the most common in big companies is dictatorship. Does anybody live in a dictatorship where your IT team tells you who has access to information and who doesn't? What is that like? Frustrating. Why? 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 Exactly. Because you want to know what's true and what's bullshit, and your analytics team doesn't have time to help you. Yet somebody else has economic ownership over truth that isn't you. That is bananas, right? So the world, however, has moved into a wonderful thing. A lot of this is because of economic pressure, because computers used to cost a lot of money, so people had to rationalize storage and compute resources. You no longer have to rationalize storage and compute resources. So you have this new thing given by Amazon and Azure. I know Amazon's the devil, but there's lots of other cloud programs with three big things. Number one is containerized cloud, which is you have a cloud resources out there in which you can run essentially virtual services within those very cheaply. Data is, you can now have data services like Amazon Redshift, Microsoft SQL Server, where you don't have to build that stuff internally. And then you have open source tools with a library of contributors that are vastly better than some of the big things that you can buy. And the value of this is it looks like a republic where the value is trust but verify, where you can partition ownership under a sharing model and then abstract decisions properly away from raw data into products, and then provide a permissioning structure around that an IT program administers but doesn't manage, right? And this is essentially, this is not a decision about technology. Technology people, IT people retreat to those conversations because they're too scared to have a conversation about what's really about, which is power and values, right? If you're a manager and you have to decision of what your values are, is that everyone for themselves do what we say or trust but verify. Trust but verify, we think, is the best way in order to meet the kind of like economic potential of what your data is providing. In terms of how this works, companies like Castora, our clients like us, et cetera, the goal is over time, you want to be able to create decision products, which is essentially abstractions of ways between your nerds and your experts. Your experts can say, this is the data, these are the parameters, this is the budget. Right? Now provide me, I think one of you said that earlier, which is provide me a set of forecasts about the future, and then a way of parameterizing that future, and then different paths to that. That's really what you want your analysts to do, is provide me a perspective on the future based on the data that we've seen in the past, the likely outcomes, the parameters around that, and then for you to arbitrate over the choices over that future. And that is the model of engagement that you want with your analysts. And you want your products to do that. This is something that we do for a big media company here. The idea is our clients import raw data. We evaluate the accuracy. The nerds essentially provide the algorithm and forecast. And the relationship with the executives is essentially deciding on the parameters, which is the budget, the states, and the different models of the future. And that is the relationship between the data team, which is providing the data, the underlying algorithms, the transparency around that, while the executives are essentially arbitrating over those different versions of the future based on their own judgments. What you'll hopefully get, and I'll move to questions, though I've asked you many questions already, is these three things. So values, process, technology, relying on intuition and habit to relying on truth and transparency. Process, using data to look back on historical performance, ideally using data to help predict and improve future performance. Technology, inaccessible data, limited resources to accessible data and analytic resources. And then finally, this is me and David Civis. It's very nice. I mean, if you don't have a great relationship with a nerd on your team, David will be speaking at my wedding. It'll be really nice, which is great, because if I speak, everybody's like, who is this jackass? But if he speaks, that's just going to be lovely. My wife has agreed to it. And so, I mean, other than that, business success can lead to beautiful friendship, and this has set the terms of a beautiful friendship. So I hope that was useful, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Any questions? Matt, do we have a question in from Twitter?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, whoa. Okay. Is it for somebody like out here or somebody in here?
I don't know.
You can ask it like IRL, like I'm right here. You don't have to ask over Twitter, like I'm right here, you're right there. You just do it like this.
So the question
Okay,
is,
all right, okay.
where have you seen companies that have the most challenges as they embark on this journey? Values, process, or technology?
I think I think the biggest problems I've seen have been descending order. Values have been the biggest by far, then process, then technology. I think technology is the symptom, not the disease. The disease is a disagreement over values, and you are seeing the manifestation of that disease in the technology choices because you haven't agreed on the terms of what that technology is supposed to do. And as a result, you sit in these long 2-hour meetings with gross PowerPoints about the 15 things you're supposed to do and the work streams and like your data architecture and all this crap. And you don't have the conversation way ahead of time, which is who has access, who makes the decision, and who is measuring whether that decision was right or whether that decision was wrong, and how does the technology support that process. That's the thing that needs to happen first. And as a result, people become distracted in technical conversations where both parties feel insecure. The experts feel insecure because they feel like they're getting completely screwed on something that's not going to meet their objectives, and the data scientists feel like they're not being listened to. Yes, IRL, thank you.
What are some of your thoughts on pros and cons of an analytics team reporting into the marketing division
Yeah.
compared to the finance division?
Yes. So I will go back to this case. So my gut is for organizations that are newer to analytics, having analytics people closer to the problem is always better, right? And the reason why is because communication costs are very high, and about complicated subjects, many things get lost in translation. I think for organizations that have deep discipline, so the campaign was an organization that had deep discipline, deep cultural commitment to facts. It was okay to have an analytics organization that reported, in our case, to the CEO, both because the marketing department and our organization felt like they were getting a good product, and we felt like we understood their problem. But if you have them in the finance team and they're over here and they aren't deeply connected to your problem set, then they're not going to be able to prioritize what's actually important. Number two is you aren't going to be able to build a relationship with them and able to dynamically kind of reprovide what you want for them. So it really is kind of based on that kind of where you're at in the evolution of your growth. If you're just beginning, I think they should be closer to the problem. Yes?
So in your language, as the nerds and the experts are reaching an agreement,
Yes.
really, in values and,
Yes.
and every layer.
Yeah, making a deal.
Making a deal.
It's 2017, making deals.
What you didn't really talk about was time,
Yes.
right, and what that agreement should look like. Like, have you noticed, like, hey, it's really good to make this agreement for, you know, a 6-month or 12-month period? I know that's a specific question, but.
No, that's not a bad question at all. So I would make, so yeah, I think there's two probably time-based things. I think you can make it arbitrary time-based or project-based. So in most of the companies that we're doing it now today, we're doing it project-based, which is to say this is the set of deliverables, this is the set of problems, and we're going to commit to a time space around those problems. We think those problems are going to take 6 months, thus we're going to commit to 6 months. You can choose arbitrary if you kind of have like a loose set of problems, but in terms of like a use case value-based prioritization to say, these are the 3 things, the 2 things are the 1 thing that's important, this is the time budget that we're going to allow ourselves, and we're going to build the process around that time budget. I think that makes people feel better because there's some instrumented accountability around it that people feel better about. So I think that's a better approach as opposed to being arbitrary. If you have to be arbitrary, select a time, ideally a time frame in which they've already produced something. Like if they've done something in 3 months, then make it 3.5 months or 4 months or something like that so you have some feedback cycle around it. But ideally use case based or project based, and then secondly arbitrary, but ideally with some performance record to support it.
All right, Dan, we've
We're
got to
done?
wrap. Stay up.
Okay.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.